There was once a god whose name was whispered not in temples, but in the pause between breaths, a god without statues, without prayers only remembered in the soil, the wind, the weight of silence after loss. But then they vanished, not slowly, not with reverence. They were erased, torn from stone, scraped from memory, swallowed by time like they had never existed at all. And here's the unsettling part. When that god disappeared, something else took its place. Our stories changed, our rituals faded, and the world we walk in today, the one we call modern, may still be echoing from what we chose to forget. Why would an entire civilization choose to forget a god? What did they know that we don't? And what happens when a god isn't just forgotten, but buried, hidden on purpose? Tonight, we follow the breath back through time to the moment the forgetting began. And by the end, you may wonder if you've heard this god's voice before. Not in thunder, not in myth, but in something far more intimate. Your own breath. Settle in. This is not just a story you'll hear, it's one you'll feel. The breath that no longer came. The morning held a hush to it, not the kind after a storm, not the kind before one. It was softer than that, like someone had stepped out of a room and forgotten to close the door behind them. Wind usually moved through this part of the valley. Not loud, not forceful, just steady, like a hand brushing across tall grass. But today, the grass stood still, and the air felt shy, as if it, too, was waiting for someone. No one in the village spoke of it. They never did. But they felt it, the change, in their lungs, in their sleep. There had once been a tree, still there, in fact, old as old could be, with bark like layered breath spiraled and cracked. Some called it the listening tree. Others didn't call it anything at all. It sat at the edge of the village, where the fog liked to linger, and the ground held onto footprints just a little too long. Not sacred, exactly, but not forgotten either. At its base sat a bowl, clay, unfired, cracked along one side like it had once been warm and then thought better of it. People used to place things in that bowl. A tooth, a piece of bread, a lock of baby hair wrapped in thread. Not offerings. Really, more like reminders, soft notes passed to something larger than them, something they did not name because naming made things too heavy. Too real. The children used to breathe into the bowl. Just that, a breath. No words, no prayer, just inhale and let go. They said the bowl would whisper back, not in sound, but in dreams. A flicker of a spiral, a hand that never aged, a name you could almost remember, but never say. But one day, and no one knew which day exactly it stopped, the breath went in and nothing came back. No dreams, no spirals, no quiet comfort in the middle of the night. Just sleep, flat and empty, like pages someone forgot to write on. A boy, or perhaps a girl, stood by the tree that morning, small, curious. In that way, children are when they do not yet know what the world has decided to forget. They held a stick, scraped a spiral into the dirt, watched it fade when the wind did not come to claim it. Their face did not fall. They just waited and then walked away, not in sadness, but with the kind of pause people carry when they have almost heard something, but know they will not hear it again. Back in the village, a mother stirred her pot with more water than soup. An old man coughed without remembering why, and the blankets, the ones folded on the edge of every wooden bed, suddenly felt too heavy. The people did not talk about the tree anymore. They did not say it out loud, but they had started breathing a little shallower, not out of fear, just forgetting. Funny thing is, no one had ever claimed to believe in the god, if that is even what it was. No shrines, no chants, no high priest in robes, just the bowl, the breath, and the spirals. Simple things, gentle things, and now absent things. That night, no one in the village dreamed. No sounds came from the tree, no leaves rustled, not even the insects sang. Only the faintest feeling, like something had paused and did not know whether to begin again. Maybe you have felt that too, that stillness, that missing hum, like your breath went out into something and never came back. Maybe this is where it began, maybe not, but this is the place they stopped whispering, and where silence started to grow roots. The one who drew spirals. There was a man in the village, or maybe just beyond it. No one remembered when he had first come, or if he had ever left. He had a beard that blended into his collar, and eyes the color of old river stones. He never spoke, but everyone knew him. Not by name, he did not offer one. They simply called him the Keeper. Each morning, while the sun was still deciding whether to rise, the Keeper made his way to the tree of stillness. He walked slowly, not from age, but from habit, like someone who had spent too many years following the same path and had learned to let the ground do the remembering. In one hand, he carried a short stick, not a walking stick, a carving stick, the kind passed down from fathers who forgot they were ever sons. He did not bow to the tree. He did not sit. He stood beside it, silent, still, and with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 mornings before. He reached out and pressed the tip of his stick into the bark, not to wound it, just to remind it. The spiral he carved was small, no larger than a teacup, but careful, deliberate. The curve was soft, with no beginning and no end. He drew one each day, always just one. Then he would touch the bowl with his fingertips, never his whole hand, and walk away. People saw him, sometimes, through window glass, or while carrying water, or when the fog was thin enough to allow for glimpses. They never asked why he did it, and he never offered reason. But somehow, no one questioned his place in things. He belonged there, like the tree, like the spirals, like silence. They say he had once been a teacher. Others claimed he had been a boat builder who never took his own craft to sea. Some believed he had lost someone, a child, a wife, a brother, but no one knew for sure, and none of it mattered. The Keeper had become part of the landscape, like wind, or shadow, or the smell of wood smoke at dusk. Children used to follow him. In the old days, before the forgetting, they would trace his spirals in the dirt behind him, laughing when they could not match the perfect curve. He never turned to correct them, but he always waited until they caught up. And once, just once, a child said they saw a spiral glowing after he left it behind. Now, there were no children by his side. The laughter had softened into the hush of grown-up routines, and though he still carved each morning, the bark did not respond. It took in the spiral without reply, like a letter never mailed. Still, he carved, not because he believed something would change, but because the act itself was a kind of breathing, a ritual to keep the quiet from getting too loud. The Keeper's hands were not young, but they did not shake. They moved like hands that remembered a different time, a time when fingers touched meaning, not machines. His thumbs were worn smooth, his knuckles darkened by memory. Sometimes, after carving, he would sit just near the tree, not quite beneath it, and stare at the sky as it turned pale gold, not watching for signs, just letting the world move past him. One morning, he did not carve. He stood in front of the tree, carving stick in hand, but did not press it into the bark. He simply watched the spiral from the day before. It was still there, a little softer, a little thinner, but whole. He touched it gently, just once, and then did something no one had seen him do in years. He smiled. No one witnessed it. No eyes caught the moment, but something in the wind that morning stirred, just enough to rustle a single leaf. It dropped beside the bowl, landing in the shape of a curve. The Keeper noticed. Of course he did, but he did not touch it. He turned, nodded slightly at the base of the tree, and walked away with slower steps than usual. That evening, a villager, the same one who baked without salt and never quite got the bread right, saw the spiral from the path. She paused, looked at it, looked at the tree, then stepped back gently. She said nothing, but that night, her dreams were different, not filled with messages or visions or gods, just warm air, spirals in water, a voice that did not speak, but hummed. And in the morning, her bread tasted just right. When trees forgot to whisper, there was a time when the tree spoke in ways people could not quite name, not loudly, not with words, but with breath, with rhythm, with a kind of low, humming presence that passed through skin rather than ears. Children used to lay beneath it, flat on their backs, heads resting on each other's shoulders, just to feel it better. It's like the ground's talking, one boy whispered. No, said a girl with a chipped front tooth. It's remembering. The tree stood just outside the last row of houses, past the little stone well. Beyond the crooked fence where the laundry line ended, it leaned slightly to the left, or maybe the hill leaned right, no one could say. The roots curved up like sleeping arms, and its limbs grew in uneven spirals, thick with bark as ridged as old knuckles. On quiet mornings, you could hear it shift. The creak wasn't sharp like a door, nor soft like a bed. It was somewhere in between, Deep, hollow, gentle, like someone older than words adjusting their chair just slightly before speaking. For years, no one thought too hard about it. The sound became part of the village, like the distant whine of kettle whistles or the creak of porch swings in summer. Then came the dry season. Longer than expected, the clouds forgot to form, and the fog stayed curled in the hills instead of drifting down. Rivers thinned, bread grew brittle, and the tree that had always made just enough sound to remind people it was still listening, went quiet. Not all at once. First the bark stopped shifting, then the roots no longer pulsed with warmth. Then the leaves stopped rustling, even when breezes brushed past. The silence was not dramatic. It crept in gently, like a coat being placed on your shoulders without warning. Some said the tree was just old. Others said it had finally fallen asleep. But the keeper, he never said anything at all. He still visited, still carved his spirals, still placed his hand on the bowl, which now held only a faint layer of dust and the edge of a broken feather. He noticed the quiet. Of course he did, but he did not force sound into it. He simply stood longer. One morning, while the sky hung low with the color of tarnished copper, a boy named Elro approached the tree alone. He had come looking for his dog, who had slipped out before dawn, chasing nothing in particular. The boy paused by the tree, unsure why he'd stopped. He looked up. The leaves didn't move. The bark didn't breathe. But the boy still took off his cap. Not out of habit, not respect, just instinct. He knelt by the roots and listened. And for a while, there was nothing. Not even birds. Then his knee brushed a small stone. Round, cool, and marked faintly with a swirl. He placed it in his pocket without thinking, then stood. He did not call out for his dog. Instead, he turned slowly, slow enough to catch the edge of a feeling in the air. A pause, not presence, not absence, just potential. He found the dog later, sitting beside the baker's door, tail curled neatly over its paws like it had been waiting for someone else. That evening, Elro placed the stone under his pillow. He dreamed not of the tree, but of a long hallway. Wooden, sunlit, empty. When he awoke, the pillow smelled faintly of pine, though his bed was near no such trees. His mother, stirring oats beside the stove, said nothing, but her eyes lingered longer than usual. That same day, a widow named Myerla brought her chair out to the hill. She hadn't sat near the tree in years, not since her husband passed. She positioned the chair not at the roots, but just close enough that the edge of the tree's shadow touched her toes. She didn't say a word, just knitted, row after row of grey yarn into a blanket that never seemed to grow. By noon, she'd fallen asleep in the chair, needles tucked into the wool, chin resting lightly against her collarbone. When she woke, the blanket was in her lap, but half unravelled. Not from wind. There was none. The thread lay gently curled beside her, ending in a soft spiral. Myerla gathered it, nodded once to the sky, and walked home. The next morning, the tree remained quiet, but a single leaf had turned, not fallen, just shifted its back to the sun, and the sound still absent, still hiding felt closer, like it might be waiting for someone to ask the right question. The dream of smoke on his shoulder. It was just past dusk when the man with the grey cap saw smoke sitting on his shoulder. He had been mending fence posts along the east pasture, the ones closest to the dry creek bed, and had stopped to drink from a jar that tasted faintly of mint and something older. He leaned against the wood, rubbed the back of his neck, and sighed the way only men who forget they are tired tend to sigh. Then he saw it not rising, not curling, just resting, a small wisp of smoke, right there on his shoulder, like it belonged. He did not move. He was not the kind to frighten easily. This was a man who had stood through windstorms with his arms folded, watching the sky shift. A man who once buried his father with no words, just 3 stones in a row, but now, with smoke perching gently against his shirt like a curious thought. He stood still. It did not burn. It did not smell. But it stayed. He blinked slowly, like someone trying to recall a face from long ago. And then, without warning, he whispered, "I remember you." He did not know who he meant, but the words came like breath wrapped in memory, like something passed down through silence. That night, he dreamed of a woman in a wheat field, her face turned away, holding a ribbon the colour of ash. She did not speak, but she left footprints in the rose spirals, soft and shallow. Word spread quietly. As things in that village often did, that strange things were happening near the edges of the known. It was not gossip, not excitement, just noticing. The butcher's daughter found her voice again after 2 years of silence. Not to sing or shout, just to ask where the old clay bowl had gone. The school teacher, who had taught the same 12 stories for 23 years, paused one morning and told the children about something that was not in the book. A god with no name, who answered without sound. A tree that forgot how to speak. A boy who listened anyway. One child asked, "Is that history?" The teacher blinked, then nodded. "In some places," she said, "the past hides inside the breath. History does not always come with battles and dates. Sometimes it comes in the form of patterns, spirals in the dirt. Habits we do not question. A bowl that gathers dust but still waits for hands. A tree that stopped whispering but still stands. Civilizations do not always fall. Sometimes they pause." The village, in its way, had paused. It still had bread and rules and rooms to sleep in, but something in it had fallen quiet. Like a song remembered halfway, the keeper felt it more than most. Not because he was wise or chosen, but because he had never stopped watching. He had seen this before, not here, but long ago, in another town. One made of pale wood and copper bells. They had forgotten, too. The god had gone quiet there first. Then the language, then the laughter. It was not punishment, just a slow turning, like breath that gets lost between the inhale and the exhale. That evening, the keeper sat by the tree longer than usual. His spiral had been carved before dawn, a slightly wider curl today. The outer edge gently slanted, like the wind was meant to rest inside it. Beside him, a small fire crackled in a tin dish. The light was soft, the color of warm tea. A girl wandered up the path, carrying something in both hands. A bowl, not the old one that once stayed by the roots, but one she had made herself from pressed sand and dried petals. It held nothing but a small stone, white and flat. She did not speak. She knelt near the keeper, placed the bowl beside him, and sat cross-legged without looking up. The keeper glanced at the bowl, then at her. Her eyes were closed, but her breathing, it matched the wind. Slow, uncertain, still arriving. He nodded. Then he leaned back against the tree and closed his own eyes. And in that moment, the tree creaked. Just once, a sound like a memory settling into the right drawer. That night, others felt it. Not heard, but felt. The kind of sound that lives inside your ribs. The farmer woke to find his goats facing east, still as prayer. The baker's cat would not leave the windowsill. The midwife dreamed of staircases and sea fog, and woke crying without shame. The next day, someone left a drawing on the public board. No name, no message, just a spiral, hand-drawn, a little uneven, but enough. The child who didn't fade. She was not the only child in the village, but she was the only one people remembered clearly. The others, dozens of them, loud and full of elbows blurred into each other. Their names, their shoes, their scraped knees all swirled together like a half-finished painting. But not her. Her name was Isla. She had a way of standing still that unnerved adults. Not fidgeting, not afraid, just still. As if she knew the world moved enough already, and there was no need for her to add to it. She would sit cross-legged near the well, or perch on fence posts like a bird that had never decided if flying was worth it. When she blinked, it was slow. When she spoke, it was never rushed. Some said she was born under an eclipse. Others said her mother had carried her too long. Either way, she belonged to the village, but also somehow stood just outside of it. She had a habit of humming spirals, not drawing them, not tracing them, humming them. It made no sense, and she never explained it. But if you listened closely, the melody would start high, fall low, circle around itself, and land exactly where it began, like sound finding its own echo. She did it while sweeping, or watching rain, or stirring paint into puddles with a stick. And people noticed, not all at once, but slowly, like their ears remembered something their minds had forgotten. One morning, Isla walked straight to the tree of stillness with no shoes on. The ground was damp, but not muddy. The dew clung to her ankles like threads pulled loose from old fabric. She reached the bowl, paused, and looked inside. Empty, as always. She didn't add anything. Not a breath, not a stone, not even her voice. She simply placed both hands on either side of the bowl and leaned in close, as if listening for a story too old to be told aloud. Behind her, 3 villagers watched, not hiding, just hesitant. One was the seamstress, who stitched with her back turned to the window. One was the boy Elro's mother, and one was a retired stonecutter who no longer cut but still held his chisel every night before bed. They said nothing, but something passed between them. Not words, just knowing. The child had not faded. Others did. Slowly, their colors dimmed, their curiosity thinned, their sleep became heavier, without dreams. But not Isla. She'd grown brighter, not in glow, not in spirit, but in presence, like she weighed more than she looked. The keeper noticed, too, from a bench nearby. He watched her that day. He did not move, did not speak, just placed his hand over the last spiral he had carved. A small spiral, tighter than usual, like a breath held. He closed his eyes, and then he remembered something. Years ago, before the hush came, he had visited another village, nestled in a wide valley beyond 3 ridgelines. They had a tree there, too, not like this one. Smaller, but sacred in their way. He had gone there looking for someone he could no longer name. Maybe a brother, maybe a friend. All he recalled now was the way the ground trembled when the villagers sang together beneath that tree. They had a word in their language, sha'alim. It meant, loosely, to ask without speaking. It was how they approached the divine, with questions that lived in their silence, not their tongues. He remembered a woman in that village, face lined with grief, fingers stained with dye from making cloth no one wore anymore. She had lost 3 sons, each in a different decade, and yet she smiled more than anyone he knew. When asked why, she said softly, "Grief is a tunnel, but memory is a house, and I would rather keep the house open." He hadn't understood her then, not fully, but now, watching Isla sit beneath the hushed tree, breathing so quietly it sounded like music, he understood. The child was not untouched by forgetting. She had just chosen a different kind of remembering. That afternoon, Isla drew something on the wood behind the baker's door. A spiral. Yes, but not just that. A spiral within a spiral, each layer thinner, more patient than the last. At the center, she placed a thumbprint. No one asked her why, but the baker's loaves rose taller that week, and one old woman who hadn't left her bed in a season sat up, sniffed the air, and whispered, "Moss," just like when I was little. The village didn't change overnight. It didn't become louder. It didn't suddenly remember how to dream, but it shifted, like a table settling on old floorboards, like the first step of someone who'd been sitting too long. And at the center of it, barefoot and humming, was the child who didn't fade. A shoot the color of smoke. It was a quiet Sunday when the shoot appeared. Not dramatic, not under moonlight. Just there, between 2 gnarled roots of the old tree sprouting sideways, no taller than a teacup. Its color somewhere between silver and dusk, like smoke that forgot how to rise. No one saw it emerge, but Isla saw it first. She'd been sitting beneath the tree since morning. No book, no basket, no blanket. Just her and a small cloth she kept folded in her lap. On it, she sometimes arranged pebbles, sometimes bones. Once, a bent spoon with a spiral scratched into its handle. That day, she just watched. The little sprout did not glow. It did not hum. It didn't even sway in the breeze, but it was present. Isla leaned close, not to touch it, just to breathe near it. And in the quiet space between her inhale and exhale, she smiled. She wasn't the only one. A young man named Jarrell passed by with a pail of grain. He had only recently returned to the village after 4 years away, working along the coast building homes from driftwood and red clay. His hands were rough, but his eyes still carried the softness of someone who had once read poetry to his mother by candlelight. He stopped at the sight of the sprout. At first, he didn't understand why. It was just a shoot, a green thing among older green things. But something about its color, it wasn't green at all. It was that smoke-colored shade he had only ever seen once before, in the ash left by a burned letter. He did not say anything to Isla. He just nodded and moved on. That night, he wrote a letter to his brother, first one in 3 years. He did not know what to say, so he wrote one line. "Something small is growing again." The villagers did not talk about the shoot aloud, but they changed their walking paths to pass near it. The earth around it stayed soft. No one stepped too close. A woman once dropped her needle nearby and reached for it with the caution of someone handling a sleeping infant. That same woman later told the cloth merchant, I don't know why, but I feel like it's listening. The merchant just nodded. He had started bringing his cart in quieter, setting down each bolt of fabric like it mattered more than it did. Even the birds returned first one, then two perched in the upper branches of the hushed tree. They didn't sing, exactly, but they murmured, in tones that rose and fell like breath. Late that week, the keeper stood before the chute. He had watched it for 3 mornings now, saying nothing, carving nothing. But on the 4th morning, he bent slowly, slower than usual, and placed a hand beside it, not touching, just resting nearby. He exhaled long and deep, the kind of breath that felt more like a memory than emotion. Then he said softly, "I once saw a tree like this before, when I was a boy. No one was near enough to hear it, except the tree, and maybe the chute." Years ago, he had traveled with his uncle through a settlement far to the south, where rain came sideways and lanterns stayed lit even in daylight. The people there believed trees were spirits born from the breath of the dead, not in a fearful way, in a thankful way. They would mark their tree roots with clay spirals, and when someone passed on, they whispered into the bark just once, then walked away without looking back. The keeper remembered asking his uncle if the tree kept all those breaths. The old man had laughed and said, "No, the tree just gives them time to rest." That thought had stayed with him, long after his uncle died, long after the clay cracked and the spirals faded. And now, standing before a new spiral of green rising from the roots of silence, the keeper felt something shift, not in the world, in himself, across the village. The cobbler sat cross-legged on his bench, repairing a shoe no one had claimed. He looked out the window toward the old tree and felt an ache that was not pain, just space. He remembered being a child and drawing a spiral on the side of a chicken coop. His mother had scolded him for wasting charcoal, but his father had smiled and said, "Let him draw. Maybe something old is trying to speak through him." The cobbler had forgotten that memory for almost 40 years, but now, as he stitched leather with silver thread, the spiral returned, not as a picture, but as a feeling. History, true history, is not always written in ink. Sometimes it hides in small growth, a new shoot, a whispered hum, a shift in habit. In cultures long gone, a sprouting plant near a sacred tree was seen as a form of return, not rebirth, but rememory, as if the earth itself was trying to recall something it once promised not to forget. Maybe that's what the shoot was. Not a miracle, not a sign, just a breath remembered. By sunset, someone had placed a small spiral of twine around the base of the sprout. No one knew who, and no one removed it. The bowl left overnight. It had been nearly 2 winters since anyone had left something in the bowl. Not because they had been told not to, not because they forgot where it was, but because, somewhere along the way, they stopped believing it mattered. Until one morning, there it was, a bowl. Not the old clay one that still rested at the base of the tree, cracked and holding nothing but dust and the memory of breath. No, this one was different. It was wooden, hand-carved, with lines etched in the rim like fingerprints trailing each other. A darker hue than most of the wood in the village, maybe older, maybe something older. It had been placed carefully, not at the center, not too close to the roots, just a little off, as if whoever left it was shy or unsure if the ritual was still allowed. Inside the bowl sat a single apple seed, smooth, glossy, scented, and beneath it, a scrap of linen, folded into a square no bigger than a child's palm. No one claimed it, but everyone noticed. The baker was the first to speak of it aloud. He had passed by early, as was his habit. On his way to draw water before lighting the oven, he paused, knelt beside the bowl, and stared not at the seed but the linen. Something about the way it had been folded, not stiff, not accidental. Gentle, like someone had wrapped a thought in cloth and asked the air to keep it safe. By midday, 4 others had seen it. By nightfall, 12. No one touched it. No one dared. That evening, the keeper arrived just after sundown. His spiral had already been carved before dawn, narrow and long today, like a river winding through a canyon. He paused at the sight of the new bowl, not surprised, but stilled. He sat beside it, not directly, but at an angle enough to watch the sky while keeping it in his peripheral gaze. He did not reach for it. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out something small. A sliver of cedar wrapped in waxed thread. He placed it near the tree, just beyond the reach of the new bowl, and said softly, from memory, not magic. Then he closed his eyes and listened, not to voices, not to wind, to space, to the room silence makes when it is shared. The apple seed did not sprout, the linen did not unfold, but something changed, not in the earth, in the people. Later that week, an old man who used to shape flutes from reeds began walking again, slowly, one hand on the fence, the other in his pocket where he kept dried lavender. He had not spoken in months, not since his daughter passed, but now, each morning, he walked toward the tree. He did not go all the way, he just got closer, and with each passing day, his steps grew more sure. He told no one, he did not need to. His feet spoke for him. Nearby, a girl named Elsie had begun sketching spirals again. She was not Isla. She was louder, sharper at the edges. Her lines were uneven, often rushed, but something in her wanted to draw them anyway. One evening, her mother asked why. Elsie shrugged. I do not know. It feels like I'm reminding something that used to be alive. Her mother said nothing, but later, when Elsie was asleep, she folded one of her daughter's spirals and placed it beneath her pillow. That night, Elsie didn't sleep more soundly, but she smiled in her sleep, a small curve at the edge of her mouth, like the beginning of a new note. In ancient towns long since crumbled, there were traditions like this leaving simple things overnight in sacred places, not as offerings, not to change the world, just to speak without sound. In southern valleys, people left honey. In northern mountains, they left ash from fires where stories had been told. The objects were not magic. They were reminders. The idea that intention alone was a form of touch. That stillness could be as active as movement. The bowl, in that sense, became a whisper returned. Not from a god, from each other. No one ever said who left the seed, but a week later, it was gone. Not disturbed, not rotted, gone. The linen, too. Only the bowl remained, now holding nothing but a pale shadow where the seed had rested. Some said the tree took it. Others believed the wind had carried it off, thread and all. But Isla, when asked, said something else. She looked at the bowl, blinked slowly, and said maybe someone needed it more. Then she sat down beside it and began to hum. The girl who hears colors. They called her Mira, though her full name was longer and softer, like a ribbon left to trail in the breeze. She was 12, or maybe 13. No one kept strict count, and she didn't either. She had hair the color of burnt wheat and eyes too wide for her small face. She never looked people directly in the eye, not out of fear, but because she was always listening to something else. Mira heard color, not in the way people see rainbows or speak of moods. She truly heard it. Blue hummed in low tones, like water moving beneath floorboards. Red buzzed slightly, like cloth against skin. Yellow laughed. Grey whispered. Green, she once said, made a sound like bones remembering how to dance. Most of the village didn't understand her, but they didn't mock her either. She was polite, she helped where she could, and she never asked for anything in return, except to walk barefoot along the southern ridge, where the wildflowers grew tangled in each other. Mira's world was not quieter, it was louder, just differently loud. One morning, after the bowl incident had started stirring talk again, Mira went to the tree alone. It was early before the sun had burned off the night fog. The mist still clung to everything like a soft breath. Even the birds held their songs a little longer than usual. She didn't go to leave anything. She went to listen. As she stepped beneath the branches, she paused, closed her eyes, let her bare feet settle into the damp earth, and there it was. The shoot, not growing yet, but alive in a way that made her knees go soft. It sang, not loudly, not with tune or melody, but it vibrated, faint and constant, like the middle note of a lullaby that never ended. And its color, that smoky grey-violet hue, was unlike anything she'd heard before. It sounded like held breath, like the air before someone says, "I'm sorry," or "I remember." She sat down near it and tilted her head. She didn't speak to the shoot. She just listened. And for the first time in her life, she felt quiet on the inside. Word spread, as it always did in places that had no newspapers but too much time. The girl who hears colors had felt something. Some ignored it. Some nodded. Some walked by the tree that evening, slower than usual, just in case. The keeper, upon hearing the news, whispered to himself, "Every century needs one." He didn't explain what he meant, but later, he placed a tiny blue bead beside the spiral he carved that morning blue. because that day the sky had hummed like forgiveness. In old mountain cultures, they spoke of children like Mira. They were called echo bearers, not seers, not prophets, just reminders, carriers of tones the world had dropped and forgotten. One such girl, many generations ago, lived near a forest where no birds nested. She sang for them, and they returned. Not all of them, but enough. Her village, too, had a tree and a story, but it burned in a lightning storm, and the people said it was never the fire that took it. It was silence, because no one had sung near it in over a decade. Mira didn't sing to the tree, but after that morning, she came more often. Sometimes she brought a satchel of dried flower petals, sometimes nothing. She'd sit for hours, whispering color tones to herself, drawing spirals in dust with her fingers. Her body almost completely still. Children watched her, curious. A few tried sitting like her. One boy, Tavin, sat cross-legged beside her for 10 minutes, then stood and declared, "I think yellow is ticklish." Mira smiled, but said nothing. The next day, Tavin returned. With his sister, she brought marbles, and slowly, the edge of the quiet began to bloom. That same week, the blacksmith, whose hands had long since forgotten delicacy, asked Mira what color iron sounded like. She paused, placed one hand over his calloused palm, and said, "Dark orange, like a sunset falling asleep." He wept, not out of sorrow, but because no one had ever told him what his work felt like before. The villages didn't change all at once. Life still held its shape. Bread to knead, goats to herd, fences to mend, but something softened. People paused more. They asked each other questions they didn't rush to answer, and more children played beneath the tree, as if drawn by something that didn't need to be explained. And through it all, Mira listened. To the tree, to the bowl, to the shoot, to the color of people's footsteps. And in listening, she reminded them that the world was still singing, just not in words. The woman who wove too tightly. Her name was Lena, but most called her the Weaver. Not out of disrespect, just habit. She had woven nearly every blanket, shawl, and funeral wrap in the village. Her fingers moved fast, deliberate, like they were racing a clock only she could hear. She lived alone in a cottage near the East Bend, where the hill dipped just enough to catch morning sun before the rooftops did. Her home always smelled of wool and dried lemon peel, and the floorboards knew the rhythm of her walk by heart. No one could recall seeing her rest. Even in her grief, she wove, especially in her grief. Her husband, a stoneworker, had passed many years ago. Quietly, without warning, they had shared few words in their final days. Not out of anger, but routine. "You doing all right?" "Mm-hmm." Same soup again, same soup. When he was gone, she didn't weep. She simply wove. Tighter, every stitch a breath held too long, every loop, a thought she couldn't say out loud. The blankets came out thick, beautiful but rigid, like they were holding something in. She gave them freely, but people began using them less. Too heavy, they said, too warm. But what they meant was, they didn't feel like sleep. It was Mira who brought Lena back to the tree. She arrived one morning with one of Lena's old blankets folded in her arms, not new, not woven after loss, but one made long ago, the edges frayed, the pattern uneven, but the threads soft as breath. Mira didn't speak. She just laid the blanket near the roots and hummed one long, slow note the color of faded blue. Lena saw her from a distance, and something inside her, a thread, maybe tugged loose. She hadn't been to the tree in over a decade, said it never spoke her language, but now something pulled her there. That evening, she walked the path, not rushed, not slow, just honest. The bowl was empty. The shoot had grown taller barely. The blanket was still there. A corner caught gently under a fallen twig. Lena sat on the edge of it. Didn't unfold it, didn't move it. Just placed her palm on the fabric she had made long before her hands learned sorrow. And for the first time in years, she whispered to herself, "I miss him." The next day, she brought her loom. Not the large one, just the small lap frame, with half a pattern unfinished. She sat by the tree and began to weave again, not tightly, not to hold something in, but to let something out. Children gathered, not close, just near enough to hear the soft clack of thread and wood. She spoke to them while she wove. Little things. The first thread always lies. Start with silence. It tells you where to go. Every knot is a story choosing not to untangle. The children didn't understand everything, But they listened, and so did the tree. In the time of the river tribes, long before books named kings and maps were drawn with sharp edges, women weavers were considered the village's heartbeat, not because they made cloth, but because they listened while their fingers moved. To people, to sky, to the soil's memory. If a weaver began tying knots too tightly, it was a sign the village had stopped breathing properly. Elders would gather, songs would be sung. The weaver would be invited to rest, to forget her duty and remember herself. Lena never had that. Until now, the spirals returned in her cloth. Not deliberate, not designed. They just formed soft, subtle curves along the edges, like breath making its way into fabric. She left her new piece at the tree one morning, didn't say why. But the next day, someone wore it, the boy Tavin, wrapped around his shoulders like a small cape. He said it made the wind feel less lonely. Lena smiled when she saw him, then went home. And that night, she didn't weave. She slept, longer than she meant to, dreamless, but peaceful. The keeper saw it all. He watched from the edge of the path, tracing a spiral on his thumb with his index finger. He'd known many weavers in his life, some who worked through war, some through famine, some through silence. But Lena, she had woven through stillness. That was its own kind of strength, and its own kind of danger. He remembered a passage from an old journal he once carried, written by a traveller from the western cliffs. To hold everything is not wisdom, it is fear wearing duty's coat. He had never forgotten that, and now, watching Lena release her grip on the thread just a little, he felt something loosen inside himself. Sometimes, healing doesn't come with answers. It comes with softer cloth, with blankets that breathe, with hands that choose rhythm over control, and with a tree that listens, even after forgetting how to speak. The fire that didn't burn, it began as a mistake, a small one, the kind that starts with good intentions and ends with too much heat. Elro, curious, impatient, always 2 steps ahead of his own thoughts, had found an old torch head buried near the creek. Rusted, half broken, but interesting. He thought it might be part of the village's old lighting ritual, something used long ago when stories were passed by flame and shadow. He carried it home, wrapped in cloth, then brought it to the tree just before dusk, hoping the keeper might say something about it. The keeper was not there, only Mira, tracing her fingers through dry leaves, and Lena, packing her loom. Elro hesitated. Then he did what boys with quiet questions often do. He lit the torch. The flame sputtered, bright for a moment, then low and flickering like it was unsure if it belonged. And for a breath, the tree seemed to pull away. No leaves shook, no bark cracked, but Mira stopped humming, and Lena's fingers froze mid-stitch. The air turned still in a way that wasn't peaceful, like a room remembering a scream. Elro lowered the torch immediately, extinguished it, said nothing, but the mark had been made, a blackened patch of earth, a silence that lasted longer than it should have. That night, the fire did not spread, but the feeling did, a heaviness, a sigh too big for lungs, like something ancient had been stirred, then disappointed. Elro couldn't sleep, not out of guilt. He didn't fully understand what he had done, but something inside him itched. He went to his father's workshop, pulled out old journals, and read until dawn. In one, he found a story from generations ago, a ceremony, a spiral of light set around the base of a sacred tree, torches lined in a circle, meant to honor the turning seasons. But one year, someone lit theirs too early. The tree did not burn, but every spiral drawn that season came out crooked. Rain came late, grain sprouted unevenly, birds migrated without reason. It was called the Year of the Bent Circle. No punishment had been issued. But after that, fire was never brought near the tree again. Not for fear, for reverence. Elro folded the page and sat in the dark. For the first time in his life, he wanted to undo something. The next morning, Mira returned to the tree. She carried no bowl, no cloth, just a single feather dipped in ash. She placed it gently over the scorched spot, then sat beside it, hummed once, low and clear, a colourless sound. The birds returned by noon, and the air began to move again. Elsewhere, the keeper walked the outer paths of the village, spiral stick in hand, but did not carve that day. Instead, he visited the home of an old woman named Sarin, the village's forgotten firekeeper. In her youth, Sarin had tended the flame pots during winter's longest night, not for warmth, for memory. It was believed that fire, when kept still and centered, reminded the soul of its shape. Now blind and nearly 90, Sarin sat in a chair that creaked in rhythm with her breath. The keeper said nothing at first, then quietly asked, "Do you remember the year of the bent circle?" She smiled. "I remember the wind refused to blow west for weeks. The sky wouldn't forgive us for speaking too soon." The keeper nodded. "It happened again, almost." Sarin's smile faded. "But the tree still stands." "Yes, then maybe this time we remembered faster." Back at the tree, something unexpected had begun to grow beside the shoot. Not a plant, a patch of moss, just a little green thumbprint on the bark. Fuzzy, fresh, like the tree had started breathing from the outside in. Lena noticed first. She touched it, gently, and whispered, "Soft as my son's hair when he was born." And without understanding why, she wept. Elro returned 2 days later. He did not bring the torch. Instead, he brought a single piece of charcoal and a drawing, a spiral, tilted, asymmetrical, but honest. He placed it near the bowl, then stepped back. Mira walked past him slowly, stopped, looked at the drawing, then nodded once. Not approval, not forgiveness. Recognition, like two memories remembering each other. Across many lands coastal, forested, mountainous ancient peoples used flame not as destruction, but as dialogue, a controlled spark, lit in silence, placed in bowls or hollowed stones. Fire was not an answer. It was a question you dared to sit near. When flames were misused, rushed, disrespected rituals paused for years. Elders taught that sacred ground needed time, not to heal, to forget the noise. Maybe the tree in this village wasn't punishing. Maybe it was just waiting until someone learned to ask better. By the week's end, the burnt patch had faded. The moss had spread an inch wider, and the spirals drawn in the dirt curved more gently again. Not because the mistake had been erased, but because the lesson had been received. The root that curled backward. It was Mira who saw it first. She had come early, before the fog rose off the hill. The kind of morning where breath came out in thin ribbons and silence felt softer than sound. She was gathering leaves dry, curled, some still golden with the last heat of summer, and tracing their veins with her thumb, letting them speak their colors aloud. And then she saw it. A root, not new, not broken, just different. It curled backward, not up, not outward like most roots do, but inward, as if folding into itself, like memory trying to return home. It emerged gently from the base of the tree, not even a finger's length above ground, just enough to catch the light. She crouched near it, tilted her head, and whispered, "You forgot how to grow forward, didn't you?" The root didn't move, but the wind, for a brief second, circled around her shoulder instead of pushing past. By midday, others noticed. The root became the village's quiet subject. Some said it was natural, just a tree adjusting, redirecting itself underground. Others thought it a sign of confusion or retreat. The keeper took it differently. He sat beside it for half an hour, then rose and walked the village slowly, stopping at each home that had ever once left an offering in the bowl. He left no message, just placed a stone at their door. Flat, smooth, spiral carved faintly on one side. He said nothing. But that evening, every door had a stone. That same night, Lena began a new weave. Not cloth, not thread. She tied thin lengths of bark, dried grass, and memory ribbon, those bits of frayed string she kept from worn-out blankets, into a hanging spiral. It had no frame, no edges. It drifted gently when you walked past it. She placed it in her window, then turned her chair to face the tree. Elro began building something. Two. With Tavin, not large, just a bench, simple wood, no carvings, no markings, but placed exactly where the shadow of the curled root reached at noon. He called it the waiter's seat. When asked why, he said, "Because it feels like the root's waiting for something." The girl named Isla brought a spoon, a wooden one, worn smooth from stirring too many quiet soups. She dug a shallow hole beside the root and placed the spoon there, then covered it with dirt. When Mira asked her why, she said, "Maybe if it tastes memory, it will remember how to stretch again." In desert cultures, those carved into red rock and wind-curled roots were seen as wisdom knots, signs the earth had remembered something and was folding it inward for safekeeping. Elders believed it meant a great forgetting had passed through, and the land was trying to remind itself how to become whole again. You did not cut curled roots, you watched them, until they decided what to become. The keeper returned to the tree 2 days later, carrying a scroll. Not paper, fabric, dyed the color of evening sky, stitched at the edges with faint copper thread. It had no writing, just a single long spiral sewn from center to edge, with no break. He unrolled it beside the root, sat cross-legged, and waited. For hours, he didn't move, didn't speak, only breathed. At sunset, Mira joined him, then Lena, then a boy with no name, who had never spoken but always watched. By dark, 7 people sat in a spiral around the keeper. None of them planned it. They just came. That night, the tree creaked. Not loudly, but enough. The kind of sound furniture makes when it's tired but still holding weight. And by morning, the root had shifted, just slightly. The curl remained, but its tip pointed outward now, just a little, like maybe it was listening across the sea. In a coastal town that hadn't existed for 300 years, there was once a belief that roots curled when ancestors were trying to return, but had not yet found the right voice. Children were taught to sleep near these roots, so their dreams could carry messages back to the soil. Those children grew into healers, not with herbs or chants, but with listening. They became known as the ones who sleep beside longing. Back in the village, Mira pressed her ear to the base of the tree. For a moment, she heard nothing. Then something, not a voice, a thrum, faint, low, like the breath of someone remembering they are not alone. The spiral hanging in Lena's window turned in the wind that evening. Slow, then slower, then still, as if resting, the return of small sounds. It began with a drip, one small drop from a dew-heavy branch, then a rustle, not the wind, but the wings of a bird lifting off slow, careful, like it didn't want to startle the air. After that came the broom, a soft sweep against Stone Elsie, brushing dust from her porch without anyone asking her to. The village didn't realize what was happening at first, but the silence that had settled for so long like a thick blanket laid across every surface had started to shift, not loudly, not all at once, just small sounds, returning. The blacksmith was the first to say it aloud. He stood outside his shop one morning, fingers blackened, apron covered in old soot, and looked up toward the hills. He tilted his head, squinted, and muttered. Sounds like the ground's breathing again. His apprentice, a boy named Reft, barely older than a lamb, didn't answer, but he smiled and left the door open all afternoon. By evening, birds had landed on the roof beams. First one, then 2, then 5. Children noticed next. They began humming again wordless tunes, made-up songs that didn't need endings. Mira joined them, not to lead, but to add colors. She said green had returned to the wind, and that the shoot near the tree had begun sounding like a question asked kindly. Lena heard this and brought her weaving back under the branches. Her fingers moved more gently now. The cloth she wove that day was thinner, lighter, and shimmered like early morning frost. She left it on the bench the one Elro and Tavern had built, and for the first time in many months, someone sat on it without asking why, back when the tree still whispered often. The village had kept a bell near the well, not a loud bell, not a call to church kind of bell, just a small one hung from a curved post, used to mark the start of morning bread or the end of field work. It had rusted in the quiet years, forgotten, but Reft found it one afternoon, hidden beneath a pile of dry vines. He carried it to the keeper, uncertain. The keeper took it in his hands, turned it over, and smiled. He rang it once, not high, not sharp, just enough, and the village paused. People turned, not alarmed, not confused, just listening. The sound hung in the air like a warm spoon in a quiet cup. Later that day, someone rang it again, not for a reason, just to hear it. It became a rhythm over the week, a tone between tasks, a reminder. In the ancient hill towns of the north, bells like these were known as echo cups, not meant to summon, but to hold memory. Each ring was believed to be a conversation between time and place. They were never rung in panic, only in peace, to say, we're still here, still listening. When war came to those hills, the bells were buried. Only a few have ever been found since. And when they are, the people do not ring them again. They just hold them, to remember. But in this village, the bell rang gently once each morning, once at dusk, and each time, something small changed. The cobbler began humming while he worked. The midwife sang to a newborn she helped deliver, even though she had not sung in years. And Elro, He carved a new spiral near the root. Not deep, just enough for rain to settle in the curve. One morning, something unexpected happened. A visitor arrived, not from far, just from beyond the ridge. A woman in her 60s, grey shawl, walking stick in hand. She didn't speak right away. She just stood at the edge of the path, gazing at the tree, the people, the bench, the small woven cloth, the shoot, and the root. Then she removed her shoes, stepped forward, and bowed not deeply, not performatively, just enough. Then she said, "I used to dream of this place. I thought I made it up." No one answered right away, but Mira stood, walked to her, and offered a flat stone with a spiral scratched faintly into it. The woman took it, closed her hand over it, and whispered, "Thank you for remembering something I didn't know I'd forgotten." That night, the tree made a new sound. It wasn't a groan or a creak, more like a stretch, a slow shift of weight. Not painful, not sudden, just ready. And beneath the bark, something glowed faintly, not bright, not mystical, just enough that if you watched long enough, you'd think the tree might be breathing again. The keeper didn't speak that evening. He sat near the bowl, now clean and dry, and placed a single drop of honey inside, then leaned back, closed his eyes, and waited for the small sounds to return. The spiral that didn't close. The keeper had carved spirals his entire life. Short ones, long ones, deep and shallow. Some you could see from across the road. Others only revealed themselves under moonlight. He had traced them into stone, into wood, into memory, but he had never once left a spiral unfinished. Until now. It happened on the 7th day after the woman from beyond the ridge arrived. The air was light that morning, the kind of sky that felt like old linen soft. Breathable, the faintest whisper of blue. He sat at his usual place, same tool, same patience. But this time, when his hand reached the final turn, he stopped. The spiral remained open just slightly, a gap not even as wide as a thumbnail. He looked at it for a long time, not in confusion, but reverence. He placed his hand over it, palm flat, and whispered, "Some things are meant to be invitations." Mira came later that morning, saw the spiral, and didn't speak. She sat beside it, closed her eyes, and hummed a tone the color of unfinished thoughts. The children who gathered nearby didn't hum along. They just sat still. Even the birds stayed quiet, as if they, too, understood that something had been left unsaid on purpose. That afternoon, Elro asked the keeper why he didn't finish it. The keeper didn't answer right away, just traced the edge of the open curve with his thumb and said, "Because healing is not a circle, it's a path that leaves room for return, across time and place." Many cultures held the spiral as sacred not for its perfection, but for its possibility. In the Western Isles, warriors drew open spirals on their shields before returning home from battle, a symbol that they were not the same, and that home would have to stretch to receive them. In desert temples, priests marked incomplete spirals into clay tablets when prayers had no answers yet, an echo left for tomorrow, they would say. And in an unnamed village that once stood near where this one stands now, a spiral was left open each season in a small stone by the well to remind those who drank from it that no truth is ever finished. That evening, Lena wove a new cloth. Unpatterned, she used only soft grey and a single thread of red. When she reached the edge, she stopped short, left the final thread dangling. No knot, no border. She folded it and placed it beneath the root that had curled backward, then turned and walked home without looking back. People began visiting the spiral intentionally now, not to touch, just to stand near it. Some brought small objects, buttons, shells, a bit of honeycomb. They didn't place them in the bowl anymore. They left them beside the open spiral. The offering had shifted from asking to honoring, from pleading to witnessing. Mira began drawing open spirals in the dust outside her home. Not many, just enough that her walkway whispered a message each time someone approached. One evening, a visitor stepped carefully around the curves and asked what they meant. She said, "There's spaces for someone's story to finish later." That week, the old root began stretching again. The curl relaxed, just slightly, and at its tip, a tiny sprout appeared, not leafy, not blooming, just the start of a start. Small, humble, real. Elsewhere, the midwife told a story, not to a baby, to herself. She whispered it one evening while rubbing oil into her own tired hands. "I once delivered twins under a moon that had no light," she said. One cried, One didn't. The one who didn't live longer grew up quiet, kind, never asked for more than bread and warmth. But each year, he'd draw one spiral, just one, always open. She'd never told anyone that. Not until the open spiral appeared again. In the months that followed, more spirals were left unfinished, drawn into frost, etched on doors, sewn into shawls. They became not a pattern, but a promise. Not all healing closes. Some of it expands, some of it waits. Some of it simply says you are still welcome. The morning the bowl spoke, it happened just after dawn, before the bread was baked, before the birds had finished their first stretch of morning song. Mira had come early, as she often did, with a satchel of soundless things. Dried petals, a feather, a strip of worn ribbon. She liked to lay them out near the tree and listen, not for answers, just for texture. That morning, though, something interrupted her listening. A sound, small, sharp, like a ceramic sigh. She turned slowly. The bowl, the old one, the cracked one that had been resting untouched beneath the tree for more seasons than anyone cared to count, had shifted, just slightly. A tiny edge lifted from the earth. Not broken, not toppled, but moved by nothing and no one. It had spoken, not in voice, but in gesture. By noon, word had traveled quietly, reverently. No one laughed. No one dismissed it. They simply came, not all at once, but like pilgrims without a script. They stood near the bowl, not staring, just acknowledging. Some nodded, some whispered thanks, some simply breathed and left. The keeper was last to arrive. He walked slower than usual that day, the kind of pace you keep when approaching something holy or something long lost. He sat beside the bowl, not too close, watched it for several minutes, then said aloud, "It's remembering what it held." Lena returned that evening, carrying something in her arms, a bundle wrapped in old cloth. She unwrapped it slowly and placed its contents 3 smooth stones, a bundle of sage, and a small woolen doll into the bowl. One by one, as if setting down memories for a friend who had forgotten how to hold them, she whispered, "For the things we carried too long," then sat and watched. Elro came next, with nothing in hand, but when he reached the bowl, he crouched low and pressed his forehead gently to the rim. He didn't speak, but when he stood, there was a look in his eyes that hadn't been there in years, like someone who had finally forgiven a version of himself that had never learned how to ask for help. In ancient highland villages, long forgotten except by the stones that still hold their shape, bowls were not just for holding grain or water. They were seen as memory keepers. Each household had one. Empty bowls were placed on thresholds during times of transition, births, deaths, departures, uncertain seasons, not to be filled, but to be watched, because an empty bowl, they believed, could sometimes reflect what the heart couldn't say. By the 3rd day, the bowl beneath the tree was no longer just a symbol. It was a companion. Mira came and placed a folded leaf inside. Elsie left a braid of thread, tied into a loop. Tavin drew a spiral inside it with a bit of soot, then erased it with his palm. Not everything left in the bowl stayed. Wind took some things, so did rain. But each morning, something new appeared. Not as offerings, but as acknowledgements. The old midwife, who hadn't knelt in years, came one afternoon and sat beside the bowl on a blanket woven by Lena. She looked at the tree, then at the bowl, and said softly, "Thank you for staying while we learned how to return." Mira heard her, but didn't interrupt. Some words weren't meant to be answered, just received. That evening, the bowl moved again, just a tilt, just enough to let the smallest object roll into the center, a bead, carved from bone, that no one could recall leaving. It clicked once against the clay, then settled. The spiral carved into its side faced upward and stayed. In far-off forest lands, the elders taught that when a bowl tilted on its own, it meant an unseen ancestor had placed a thought inside it. Not a warning, not a prophecy, just a nudge, a reminder that the past does not disappear. It listens. The next morning, Mira arrived early again. She sat in her usual spot, but this time, she sang a full melody, no colors, just notes. It was a lullaby her grandmother used to hum while shelling peas, the kind of song that meant nothing and everything. The bowl didn't move, but the birds sang with her, and one leaf, just one, drifted down and landed inside the bowl, perfectly curled. The keeper came later. He placed no objects. He carved no spiral. He simply sat and said, "Let us not try to name what this is." He smiled. "Let it remain slightly unknown, like a story half told at the end of a good meal." And from that day forward, no one called it the bowl anymore. They just called it her, not because they thought it was a person, but because she had listened long enough to become something more. The smoke that didn't leave. It had rained the night before, not heavily, just enough to remind the roofs they still mattered. The ground smelled like old stone and rosemary, the kind of scent that lingered longer than the weather itself. By morning, a light smoke rose near the base of the hill, not from fire, from ember. Someone had lit something just before dawn. Not a torch, not a signal. A bundle wrapped tight with dried sage, lavender, and a few thin curls of birch bark, laid softly at the base of the spiral bench. It burned slow, no flames, just a quiet thread of smoke spiraling upward, like it wasn't in a rush to reach the sky. People gathered, not in panic, in stillness. It was Mira who noticed it first, the scent. "Memory," she whispered. Others nodded, not because they understood, but because they felt the same word somewhere between their ribs. The keeper arrived, palms open. He crouched beside the smouldering bundle, examined it, then stood and said, "Someone is marking grief, not their own, ours, in old stone villages carved into cliffside." It was once believed that grief didn't just live inside people, it lived in the land. And when too much of it went unspoken, the earth would weep in its own way. Cracked wells, sick trees, wayward winds. To keep balance, the people performed letting smoke, small, controlled burns of scent and story. They didn't speak aloud. They just lit memory into air, not to forget, to soften the shape of what remained. By mid-morning, the smoke was still rising, still gentle, still fragrant. But something had shifted. It wasn't just scent anymore. It was shape. It curled in patterned spirals. Yes, but also loops that didn't close. Half moons, faint echoes of vines. Children sat in a row, watching as if they were learning a new kind of handwriting. Elro arrived and sketched one of the curls in the dirt. "This one," he said quietly, "looks like a promise someone couldn't keep." No one corrected him, because they all saw it too. Lena came later, carrying a cloth she had woven just the day before blue, dark and soft like twilight. She laid it near the smoke, sat down, and closed her eyes. Someone asked gently, "Was it you who lit it?" She shook her head. "No, but I've needed to for years." That night, the smoke was still there, barely, just a thread now. But no one tried to end it. They left it be, and it stayed. The next day, someone added rosemary to the ash. The day after that, someone else brought juniper. By the fourth day, the smoke had taken on a rhythm, a slow pulse in the air, like the land was exhaling at last. Mira noticed something else. The tree had grown quieter, not in the way it had before when silence meant retreat. This was a resting quiet, a full quiet, like a person who had finally said what they needed to say, and now could just sit. The bowl didn't take anything those days. Not a single offering stayed. Every morning, it was empty, clean, dry, but no one felt ignored. If anything, they felt seen, because sometimes absence isn't neglect, it's trust. The keeper shared a story that week, one he hadn't told in decades, about a village that once lit fires every night not for heat, but to keep ghosts away, until one winter they forgot and nothing happened. No ghosts came, no bad dreams, no strange winds, only peace. The village learned then that maybe the ghosts were never enemies. Maybe they were ancestors waiting for the fire to stop, so they could sit down. That night, the firekeeper Sarin, long silent, long tired, asked to be taken to the spiral bench. She said nothing on the way, only breathed. When she sat, she reached into her coat and pulled out a small matchbox. She opened it. Inside, nothing but ashes. She smiled and whispered, "Perfect." The smoke rose one final time that night. Thin, delicate, a last ribbon, no flame, just the scent of sage. And goodbye. When morning came, the air was clear, the grass held dew, the bench was warm from sun, and the tree stood taller, not by inches, but by presence, like it had grown not in body, but in trust. No one lit a new fire after that, not because they feared repeating the ritual, but because they knew it wasn't theirs to repeat. It had served its season. It had carried the grief. And now, The air could breathe again. The day the spiral faced the sky, it was Mira who saw it first. Again, she had come early, as she always did now. With hands clean and quiet, she no longer brought objects, just her breath, her noticing. That morning, something in the light was different, softer, as if the sun had asked for permission before touching the grass. And there it was, not drawn, not placed, but grown, a spiral, carved not into wood or stone, but formed by the shoots near the tree, 5 of them, curling slowly around one another like old friends coming back together. The pattern faced upward, toward the open sky. She crouched near it and didn't speak, just pressed both palms to the earth beside it and stayed. By mid-morning, others had arrived. Some stood, some sat. No one walked over it. The shape was too clear, too deliberate. A message, but not from hands, from roots, or memory, or something older still. Elro was the first to speak. It's asking us to look up, not metaphor, not riddle, just direction. They had spent so long looking down, at bowls, at soil, at themselves. Now the spiral pointed where they'd forgotten to look, above, into openness, the keeper knelt, eyes soft. It's finished, he said, but then corrected himself. No, not finished, unfolded. In the northern plateaus, spiral gardens were planted in drought years, not for harvest, for hope. The pattern allowed the wind to pass gently and the rain to stay longer. Children were taught to trace the shape with their feet, barefoot, just after sunrise, because healing, the elders said, entered through the soles first. Once, during a harsh winter, one such spiral bloomed wildflowers 3 months early. They called it the turning and left it untouched for decades. Not all spirals grow in dirt. Some grow in breath. That evening, Mira asked the village to gather just before dusk. No fire, no food, no ceremony, just presence. They formed a circle around the spiral, not tight, not planned. Some with blankets, some just with themselves. Mira stood in the center and said, "We've walked enough. Now we can rest." Then she lay down beside the spiral and looked upward. One by one, others joined her, not lying flat, just leaning back, necks bent, faces tilted, eyes adjusting to the wide, quiet sky. It was the first time many had looked at the stars in years. No one remembered when they stopped, but somehow grief had trained their eyes toward the ground. Now, under the spiral of shoots, their gaze softened, and the stars returned the favor. A child named Ivy pointed upward and whispered, "That one looks like a spoon." Laughter light, unforced, moved through the circle like wind brushing wheat. Lena touched her chest gently. Then Mira spoke again. "Not everything ancient is buried. Some of it waits above." The keeper closed his eyes and told the oldest story he knew, about a village where the sky once fell silent. No stars, no moon, just black. And the people, afraid, dug into the earth to find what they'd lost above. What they found instead was themselves, their fears, their guilt, their own unfinished spirals. And when they faced those, the sky returned not to reward them, but because it was never gone. They had simply stopped being able to receive it. That night, no one left early. Some stayed until the cold crept in. Others lay back with arms behind their heads and asked each other small questions, ones that didn't need answers. Did you ever think this place would feel soft again? Why does quiet sound warmer now? Do you think the tree dreams? The tree stood still, but beneath its bark, the spiral of shoots glowed faintly with dew, each drop catching a star, not reflecting, holding, like memory choosing to stay present, instead of drifting. Mira closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "This is what trust feels like when it has nowhere left to hide." In a cliffside temple once lost to sandstorms, archaeologists found a carved spiral on the ceiling. The only one. All others had face down, or inward, or along the floor. This one pointed to the sky, and beside it, chiseled in script barely readable, "When you can no longer carry what is below, lift your eyes." And so they did, that night, and many nights after, not searching, not asking, just remembering how to lift their gaze without fear. What stayed behind? The spiral had faced the sky for 3 days now. No one touched it. Not out of fear, out of gratitude. It had become something else, not just pattern, not just growth. An answer, perhaps, or a question that no longer needed to be asked aloud. The village began to move differently, not faster, not busier. Just lighter. Children played beneath the tree again, tracing their own spirals in the dust, but not trying to copy the one nature had given them. Their shapes were messier, playful, imperfect, and they were left unfinished on purpose. Mira watched and smiled, because children, she believed, remembered things adults had tried to unlearn. Elro spent his mornings near the spiral now, not sketching, just sitting, listening. He had once tried to draw every sound this place made. Now he was learning to let them pass through him instead. He told Mira one day, "I thought remembering meant holding everything, but maybe it just means not running away." She said nothing, but placed a small pebble beside him. No spiral, just smooth, as if memory didn't always have to carry shape to be true. Lena, too, changed. She still wove, but only on Sundays, and never with urgency. Her cloth became lighter, almost translucent. She didn't know why. The threads moved easier now, and the knots unknotted themselves without her needing to force them. "I used to weave so nothing would fall apart," she said to the keeper. "Now I weave because I want to remember how things come together." In one quiet evening, the old midwife stood near the bowl, now simply her, and placed inside it a small circle of dried wheat. She said to no one in particular, "For what came through us." "And for what stayed behind?" Mira overheard, asked gently. "What do you mean?" The midwife just pointed to the ground. "Some roots don't grow to bear fruit. Some only stay so others won't be alone." The keeper understood. He walked the edge of the village that week, spiral stick in hand, but carved nothing. Instead, he rubbed smooth the oldest spirals he had made, not to erase, to bless, to give them rest, he said, so new stories have room to stand. Long ago, in the stone-ringed valleys of the East, elders believed that every generation was born with two stories, one to carry forward and one to lay down. You did not know which was which until you listened long enough to both. Only then could you choose what to plant and what to let stay behind. They called this the turning of the heel because the story you let go would always walk just behind you, keeping you upright, even in silence. Mira started humming again in the mornings, not just colors. Now, notes with shape. A tune that felt like sunrise touching the shoulder of someone who'd forgotten they were warm. And when people passed her, they started humming too low. Soft, not in rhythm, not in harmony, but together. Like a town learning to breathe with its own lungs again. The tree stood still through it all, its bark more textured now, its branches fuller, but it didn't bloom, didn't glow, didn't perform, it just was. And in being, it taught them everything they needed to remember. One morning, Mira sat with the children near the spiral and asked a simple question. "What do we do now?" A girl named Elsie answered without thinking. "We keep noticing." That was all. That was enough. That night, the village held no festival, no feast, no closing ritual. They just left candles at their doorsteps, one per home. Some flickered, some blew out early, but most stayed lit. And from above, if you could have seen it, the village made a spiral of its own, one that faced inward, toward memory, toward roots, toward what stayed behind. The path with no name. It was Ivy, the youngest among them, who found it. She hadn't meant to. She had only wandered feet bare, heart open along the tree's edge, where moss met dust. The path wasn't carved, wasn't cleared, just noticed. A stretch of soil where the grass leaned gently aside, where the stones had lined themselves in an almost spiral, and the wind moved low and quiet. She called it a trail, but Mira, upon seeing it, shook her head and said, "It's not a trail, it's a remembering." The village gathered at sunset, tracing the path with their eyes. It curved away from the tree, not toward the hill, not toward the fields, just away, like an invitation without an address. Elro stood at its entrance and whispered. "Did someone make this?" The keeper answered softly. "Perhaps, or perhaps enough of us simply stepped in the same hope, without realizing." In an ancient borderland far beyond the riverlands, old wanderers believed that some paths found people, not the other way around. They called them soul turns. They appeared not after maps, but after stillness. And no two people ever saw the same version. One elder wrote in a journal, "The path appeared when my grief no longer needed an audience." The path here was narrow, but steady. No signs, no warnings, just one faint spiral carved into a stone near its start. Not the keeper's work, not Elro's. Just there, Waiting, Mira was the first to step on. Not far, just 3 steps she stood, eyes closed, and smiled. It feels like walking into a story someone else started, but meant for me to finish. That evening, no one followed her. They let the path be, like a letter unopened, a door unknocked. Some truths need to linger a little longer before being touched. The next morning, Lena left a bundle beside it. 3 things: a piece of sky blue cloth, a wooden needle, and a bit of thread pulled from her own sleeve. She didn't say why, but when the keeper saw it, he nodded. Some roads, he said, don't require feet, just permission. The bowl still simply her remained near the tree. She hadn't moved since the last leaf had fallen, but something about her seemed different now. Lighter, like a vessel no longer tasked with carrying what the village could now hold themselves. Mira kissed the edge once, said, "Thank you for listening longer than we knew how to speak," and left her alone. That week, no new spirals were drawn. Not in bark, not in dirt, but they showed up anyway. In clouds, in the way smoke curled from tea, in the shape of water rings left on cloth. They were no longer placed. They were recognized, like the world was whispering. I was always here. You're finally looking. The path remained, untouched, respected, but no longer mysterious. Just part of the landscape now. It wasn't marked on maps. No one tried to name it. That was the rule Mira had whispered aloud to Ivy. If we name it, we'll start trying to own it. So they didn't. They just remembered it. By walking nearby, by glancing without claiming, by believing that not all meaning must be spoken. In the far southern Isles, elders taught that the deepest form of memory is the one you trust to return on its own. They left parts of their stories untold, so children would have room to finish them differently, not because they didn't know how they ended, but because every ending should make space for someone else's beginning. And so it was with the path. It would wait, not in silence, but in welcome. On the 7th day, Ivy returned with Mira. She held her hand, stepped once onto the path, and whispered, just in case someone's waiting. They walked together, not far, just enough to feel something shift in the wind, then turn back, because it wasn't time yet. But it would be. That night, the stars came early, not dramatic, just sure, and the village bowl, bench, tree, root, cloth, spiral, smoke, and all stood quietly beneath them, whole but not finished. The candle never burned brightly. It didn't need to. It was never meant to chase away darkness, only to remind the room that someone still cared enough to strike a match. Each week, Lena lit it just before dusk. No ceremony, no announcement, just a breath, a pause, a small act of remembering. That flickering flame in her window became the last word the village didn't say. Mira would often pass by, always slowing, never stopping. She'd glance at the flame and smile, not because it said anything new, but because it said everything. Again, Elro carved his final spiral in silence, this time on the underside of the bench. He called it the goodbye you give when you're finally ready to stay. The path, still unnamed, remained open, not widened, not claimed, just there like a gentle question left at the edge of sleep. The children made spirals in the frost each morning. They never looked back to see if they remained. Maybe they didn't have to. Maybe it was enough to have made the shape with their breath in the cold air. A soft echo that faded, but never quite left. What stayed? Not the carvings. Wind smoothed them, not the bowl. She cracked, gently, one spring morning, and no one mended her, because some vessels are complete even in their breaking. What stayed was the rhythm, the quiet way people greeted one another now, the comfort in stillness, the ease of looking at the sky and not needing to fill it with meaning. In the great stone cities of old, the ones buried deeper than history books ever go, people built rooms without doors, without windows, without use, just silence. They called them listening chambers. Not for prayer, not for words, just for presence. A place where memory could rest without needing to be retold. This village had become such a room, a lived-in, imperfect, beautiful chamber of slow breaths and shared echoes. And maybe that's the truth we forget when history gets too loud. That some of the most important stories were never shouted, they were whispered. In kitchens, in gardens, at the edge of sleep. They were kept not in books, but in the way someone ties a scarf, or stirs their tea, or hums a tune without knowing why. The candle still flickered, not every night, but often enough And if you were to walk past that window decades from now, you might see its light, faint, steady, a spiral in flame. And so, dear listener, if you've come this far, I want to thank you not just for your time, but for your stillness, for letting this story unfold slowly, for breathing between the words, for trusting silence to speak, because that's what history really is, not just names and dates, but moments that still echo when no one is talking. And if anything from this tale found a quiet corner in you, let it stay there, let it flicker, let it become a spiral that doesn't close. And if you'd like to share this stillness with someone else, light a candle, leave a quiet comment, or just send this story to a soul who needs something gentle. Maybe they'll remember something too. If someone ever taught you how to listen softly, or left something behind that still lives in your rhythm, tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if this story helped you sleep, helped you feel, helped you remember, leave a below. That's our way of saying the spiral still lives. Thank you for listening, and thank you for remembering.